actually get into Revit, I wanted to talk through a little bit of the CAD file setup. So, as you know, we did some cleanup, right? Really, like now isolating everything down to just the design work. You can always import multiple CAD files or link multiple CAD files in Revit. So, there's no reason why you can't add the survey later. You need it, but you really want to cut this down. A few other things that I've done. I like to set my building heights. See, this is at 549 here. I like to set them at somewhere around what one of the touching contours is, just so that in Revit I don't have building heights at the bottom and my contours high up. And something to remember is that the architects will do the 3D modeling of the buildings for you anyway. So you get kind of like bonus information about how to model sides of buildings, but really you'll get this already done.
Are you setting it for the floor elevations, or are you setting it for the building at a finished height?
I'm not setting the height of the buildings at a finished height, and it's not even really the floor elevations. Just this is more for you in studio. I want you to have a building line work that's near the contour elevations. But the buildings would have the correct building height. They'd have the foundation at the right height. They'd have the finished floor set at the right height. So for me, I'm just wanting it to look a little bit like this, where my buildings are not, way down at the bottom of this model. So if I look at it in 3D, I just set these building heights so that they're near everything else. But we're going to approximate the building volumes, at least to start with. Yeah.
So is it a good idea to kind of just delete everything that's
Yeah. For now, yeah. And things that are blocks can stay blocks, but it is a good idea to delete the rest of the campus. And there's several frozen layers in the survey that you want to unfreeze and delete. You want to save that survey because you can link the CAD into Revit if you wanted to, but you want to kind of trim everything down now and save it maybe as a separate working CAD file. And you don't have to trim it as far in as I have, but mentally be thinking about how you might set up your sheets down the road and how much you want to show. But we can always link XREF that survey back in here. I've also done some basic lines, just like you all have, to show, here I've got some stairs, a ramp, a landing, and then I just did this little arc as a retaining wall. And I even set those to have an elevation somewhere in the ballpark of where I want them to be. Here I put 550. It doesn't really matter what you set them at in AutoCAD if for importing into Revit. I'm just trying to get them so that they're all floating and around the same place. I'm going to really dial them in once I get into Revit. And if you end up going back and just working in AutoCAD, the actual elevation of anything in AutoCAD can all be zero, and then you can just annotate just like you would by hand, however you want. So it actually doesn't have to contain that information. It's only the Revit model where the annotations actually reflect the real world elevations. So I'm just setting them at, here I set them at 550 so that when I import my CAD, everything's kind of near everything else. Right? So you can see that my contours are here. Right. So is this. Okay. The next thing I did with my setup was, remember we have our levels, and they all start at sea level by default. I usually get rid of a lot of them. I keep level 1 because most things I create attach to level 1 as a default. And so it just kind of gets a little bit messier if I don't have a level 1. So I just leave that down here at the bottom. And a lot of architects use level 1. But I took my other levels and I changed their name and I changed their elevation. Right? So let's take this one. So you can actually change its name here and click into its elevation here and change that number. right? So I change it, and I just set these at intervals of 10 just to have something to start to. But like if you know actual elevations of things that you want, and most of you do, it's at the 541 contour, or you can set those levels so that it's very easy to attach things to them. What I wouldn't recommend is making levels with fractions of a foot, but instead just offsetting things at those intervals. So if I have a wall that needs to be at 541.6, I wouldn't make a level that was 541.6. I'd make a 541 level, and then I'd offset it zero point 0.6. Right? And I just do that by taking everything that's an object in Revit is attached to a base level. And I keep level one also so that my contours that are, X so many feet above sea level relate properly to the bottom of the drawing, which is at 0. But you can always take anything and offset it in feet and inches or in percentages or decimals from that level. Right? So I want level one to be at 0 because the elevations of my contours depend on being the elevation they are above 0. Right? If I got rid of level one and I had this drawing attached to like my 540 level, then my contours would be, like 500 something feet above that. So you don't have to set your line work to have elevations the way I did the walls and the ramps and stuff. I just do it so that I'm looking at everything near everything else. But you do need your contours to have the right elevation. So you want to go in and click on them, and in their properties, just make sure that the elevation is set to the right intervals. Contour elevation, right? Thank you for helping. So set your contours to the right elevation so that they come in the right elevation in Revit. Okay. Any questions?
Should we tell him? Did he go get another?
He did. He did. Sure. Thanks. Yeah, Lauren. So, are you talking about in CAD prepping it for Revit or modeling it in Revit? Are you wondering how to not? You're not wondering how to draw the circle, just like how to control it. Oh yes, right. Okay. Right. Okay. So something like yes, this circle, which is not a polyline. So what I would set that to then is yeah, right. I think it would be fine for something like that to just leave it at 0. Yeah. I mean, I'm only setting the dimension. Sorry, now I understand your question. I'm only setting them having an elevation. It's more like for convenience, so that. But what will happen instead is, yeah, you have like a type of line work that doesn't have an elevation. It will just be down here, which is fine. Like the way I end up drawing things is by picking lines in plan anyway. So you'll just want to attach it to a different level. So it's more that I want my CAD line work to all be just like at about the same elevation, but it's just good for convenience. Yeah. Right. So the fact that the building is in like this annoying cube, right? Yeah. Um, Not really. I guess I do have this one line. So I have one little detail that I could get rid of. I think it's still going to look like a big column, like with a big box around it, because it is still going to be anchored down at this level. And I don't want to change that because I want my contours to be at the right height. The only workaround I could think of for that is like I could see starting my contours not at 500 but at 100, right? And attaching them to a level that's like 400 feet high. It's like a workaround, but it's still going to give the same result. It's just the box around it won't be as big. So, yeah. So, and I've only ever seen people work the way I'm working, which is normally working with a CAD file with the actual elevations and then just dealing with the way it works in Revit. It's not ideal. What would be nice in Revit would be if you could set like a base elevation for your file, like set the starting point of your elevation down here to whatever you wanted it to be and not zero. Right? That would be nice. But you can't do that. And like I said a couple of classes ago, if you're working somewhere where the altitude is, 6,000 feet above sea level, you're realistically not going to actually do it that way in Revit, or your model, you'd have to like look up at it. It'd be like way up there. Then you would sort of make some assumption, like you could start your elevations at 6,000 feet, but actually call 6,000 feet zero or something like that, so that the model actually is somewhere close to zero. You know, for the projects that at least the undergrads are working on, something like the 500, 600 elevation above sea level, you would still do it this way. If anyone's working on a project at the graduate level that has dramatic altitude, then I would make an adjustment to your contour values. Um, and that's probably the way to go. But all your spot elevations are going to be off, so you just need to put a note to add however many thousands of feet to them. Or you can do them, annotate them by hand. We'll get to that later, though. The main thing I want to focus on today is a little bit of the modeling of the landscape, and a little bit of visibility stuff. So I was trying to find this last class and I couldn't remember, but a place to just have control over what's visible and not visible in a linked CAD file. Right? If I go in and I freeze or hide something in AutoCAD, it's still going to show up in Revit. Revit doesn't know that the light bulb's off or it's got a little snowflake. So instead, I need to control the graphic display in Revit. And so this comes in very handy because you may not want to see all this stuff at the same time. So there's the way to do that is under the View tab here. And there's a little icon close to the left called Visibility and Graphics. This Visibility and Graphics is the same as the Visibility and Graphics for any view, and it is view dependent. So in a tabbed view, when I click on Edit next to Visibility and Graphics, I can edit the Visibility and Graphics properties for this view. If I go to Visibility and Graphics here, I can control it. I think it's per view as well, but it's just another way to get to it. So that's important to know. I can change how something looks or whether or not it's visible in 3D view, and as an example, and it's not going to impact the visibility and graphics in any other view. That's a good thing, though. Can anyone think of why that might be a good thing? Think about what we're going to be doing. We're going to be setting up different sheets where different things are going to be showing or not showing, or are going to be visualized in different ways depending on the conventions of that view. So Revit makes it really easy for each view to have its own graphic controls. So what we end up doing with our plan, say we have a planting plan and a materials plan and a layout plan and so forth, we duplicate our site plan view and we rename it whatever view it is, and we adjust the visibility and graphics just for that view, so that we don't have to change, hide and show layers or change the visibility of line work in CAD. We just adjust the visibility for every Revit view. So it might seem annoying, but it's quite a good thing. And in visibility and graphics, you can change how any type of modeled Revit thing looks, right? You have controls over lines, patterns, transparency, section cut, right? Halftones. And then in each of these categories, there's subcategories. And then it's easy to miss, but there are actually tabs of categories in visibility and So by default, you really just use the model categories, visibility and graphics, but there's also visibility and graphics for every type of annotation, analysis, which is not really for us, filters, and imported categories. And imported categories is the one that we want. So again, we can either click in our properties for visibility and graphics and click on edit, or we can do this, go to view and visibility and graphics, and it gets us to the same place. Okay. So we want to go to imported categories, and here we can see any CAD file we've imported. And if we click on the plus, we can actually see all our layers. And by unchecking any of those layers, we can hide them from that view. So if I do this, it will hide anything on layer 0. So this will allow me to hide things I don't want. So a convenient use of that is when we make a topo surface and we have contours that also were used to generate that topo surface. So let's do that. This is a redo of what I showed you in a previous lecture, where I go to Massing and Site, Topo Surface, Create from Import, select Import Instance, and I just click on my CAD. I click on Check None, and then I just click the 1 or 2 or however many layers that have contour information, and I say OK, and it generates a topo surface based off those contours, and I can either escape from this and not do it, or I can finish it. So now I have this solid model. It's like a 3D model. And when I go to my site plan, probably the most annoying thing is now I have multiple contours that are not, I don't want to see both of them. And the more useful information to me in Revit is not the CAD contours, but it's the weird looking Revit contours. So here is where I would go to my site plan, right, and go to edit visibility and graphics, go to imported categories, expand my CAD, and uncheck the same exact 2 layers of contours that I used to generate that topo surface. Now I hide them. And instead I have these ugly things, right? But for the time being, when I do my grading in Revit, I work with the topo surface and the points. And then as a final step, we usually draw nicer looking contours and display those, and don't display the contours of the topo surface. You can also change how the topo surface display looks if you want to, right? So I can go to topography and I can uncheck contours, and it actually gets, you can see that it got rid of my topo surface contours. So in the end, what landscape architects do, because there is no excellent tool for working with contours and updating the grading, is they go in and they end up hiding the Revit contours of the topo surface and showing their own redrawn contours. I did not mean to click triangulation edges. So this is the way that every landscape architect uses Revit works. So you would go in and either in CAD or using something called model lines, you would draw the nice looking non-jagged contours and kind of float them above the topo surface. And remember, you really only need contours for your grading and drainage plan, so they're just used once. So that's how we would do it. So for now, we're going to hide those contours. Okay. You can see them here. Now we have these Revit contours. I've got my site plan here. And this is where, when you have contours that are stacked, they're for like a retaining wall. That's where I kind of intentionally made a mistake, right? I drew them, and it's not the right way to generate a topo surface, right? Because you get a really weird triangulated edge. What I really want to do is have my contours and my topo surface meet that wall and not actually create the wall, right? So what I should do is I should go back into AutoCAD and I should get rid of these contours. Where I want a retaining wall, I'm going to have a retaining wall. Right? Eventually, if you're going to end up doing your final work in AutoCAD, you do want those contours when it's just like a ramp, right? But in Revit, we don't want to create geometry that's like a ramp or a wall out of contours. We want to actually model the architectural elements. Right? So one thing I could do is I could go in and I could change that in AutoCAD and delete my topo surface and relink my CAD. But I can also go into edit surface. And remember I was talking about how you can edit points. Right? So I could delete all these points and just delete them. And it'll kind of regrade this. So I can also go in and just clean up that mess. Anyone know why I still see my CAD contours? But I hid them, right? Thank you. Yeah, I only hid them in my site view. The visibility and graphics here don't apply here. So I might decide that I also want to change my visibility and graphics and go to imported categories, right, and uncheck those. They're not useful to me anymore, right? So now I don't see them here. So that's something that can get very confusing. Right? So we're not going to get into the fine detail grading just yet. Right? Just the simple stuff. But I can go in and I can start to clean that up so that I essentially have a topo surface that's representative of the grading I've done in AutoCAD. And the next thing I wanted to show you was how to create some of those hardscape elements. What we're looking for next Friday is a Revit file with a topo surface, hardscape elements like stairs, ramps, paths, landings. That's really it. And I don't want you to go in and start fussing around with, like, if you have a ramp that has a cross slope for drainage or it sheets off from the outer edge to the inner edge, just make them flat or angled in a single direction for now, and we can play around with it later. Sometimes it's not actually necessary to get to that fine detail level of grading, and you just annotate on top of it what it's supposed to be. Sometimes it is important to actually tie everything in, but for now we're just going to sort of work out the essentials. Okay, I'll stop for any questions. So step one is make a topo surface, and that is incredibly easy. Okay. Step two is to start to get in some of the most essential hardscape. We're not going to do any kind of vegetation or planting yet. That will show up in two different drawings. The vegetation will show up in our planting plan, and any kind of soils or sod can show up in our materials plan. But we don't actually need to worry about it in our model just yet. And in fact, we really won't deal with a lot of that on a whole model basis. A lot of it will be modeled and shown in just certain views. So when it comes time to do the view that we're talking about, or the drawing, that's when we'll teach you the AutoCAD and the Revit way to make that happen. So right now we are really just concerned with massing out the basic elements that will show up in pretty much any drawing. Right? Okay. So my preferred way of working is to mostly work in plan and like have my 3D view over here just to kind of comprehend it three-dimensionally. I'm going to change a little bit of the size of them. Okay, so I'll start with some simple building faces. Again, remembering this is typically not our job, but I just want a wall on either side just to articulate that building edge. And so I'll click on wall, and I can now either draw freehand, right? I can just draw a line here, or I can use pick lines if I want to draw something really detailed. Right? And this lets me just pick lines from within my CAD. If I can't see my lines because they're under here, I can change this from solid to wireframe, and now I can see through everything just like in AutoCAD. So I could pick like this line, just what I need. And you can see over here, most likely, that I'm creating walls, but they're actually down here, right? So I can't tell, there's no way I could know that in plan. It has to be, it's only possible to know that in 3D or elevation. Right? Now I can actually see those walls. So what I want to do is go in and select the whole thing and adjust those walls. Right? Remember, I can drag this way from the left to select only things that are included, or I can drag from the right to select everything that my selection window touches, just like AutoCAD. Sometimes, though, like, I don't know, let's say I'm not doing a good job. I want to also select something else that way. So sometimes there's so much going on that even dragging from the left doesn't allow me to just isolate my selection to the thing I want. So I wanted to pause on the wall creation and show you a powerful thing in Revit, which is filtering your selection. So anytime I've selected more than one thing, let's say, first of all, the properties go away because the properties are different for a level than they are for a CAD file, than they are for a wall. So I don't actually have any universal shared properties. But what happens when I've selected more than one thing is I can get this little thing that looks like a funnel, and it's the filter. And it's a simple way of, I can uncheck everything, showing what I've selected by category and allowing me to refine that selection by category. So, to add a little bit more to this, right? If I put a door on here, right, and I put another door, and you can see them showing up in plan here, right, and I put a window. So now if I want to select and filter, you can see that I have many categories that I can choose from, and that makes it really easy to work in this kind of compressed space that 3D modeling has. I'm going to just take those off there. So back to what I was trying to show you, which is changing the properties of my wall. I'm first going to eliminate levels from my selection, and now I have control over the properties of the walls in my selection. So the first thing that I want to do is change my base level to one of these, right? And I can set my wall height, right? It's definitely more than 10 feet. It's probably more like 20, or even in the case of Marshall, closer to 30. And then I can apply that. So my walls have now jumped up to here. Right? And I'm a little bit less concerned with the walls being the exact height of the building and just being something that is tall enough that it starts to constrain the space. I haven't even modeled the rest of Marshall. And you can do it the official height of the thing if you want. So I'm going to do the same thing with Moon here, and I can go in and do pick lines. They've got these little bump outs, right? So I'm going to go back to hidden lines so that I can have a little bit more control over what I'm selecting. The error I get here is the wall is slightly off axis and might cause inaccuracies. That's fine. Something like this, right? You get a lot of errors when you're using something like pick lines, like things overlap. With walls, it's no big deal. With floors, it's a total disaster if things overlap. You've experienced this. Like, it can't happen. Right? Walls can overlap in the real world, but floors in Revit world can't. Right? So it just gives you a little warning. And then I don't know of a way, maybe you do, Lisi, or someone else, of setting the level that I start drawing at. I think when I start sketching, I can change the level I'm at, but I usually just change it after. Yeah? Yeah, if I go to make a wall. Yeah, I think you can change the level that you're working on, but I always just do it after. Doesn't really matter. So I will also set these to 550. And 550 is just my go-to. I might need to, yeah, the site definitely is lower than that at points. So I could set them to 540, or I could also go in and select all my walls here. and I could drag them down. There should be a little handle. I guess I can only do it wall by wall. Right? I can take a little handle and drag it down. What I might do instead is select all these walls and set it to the lower level. Right? Set it to 540, and I'll apply that. You can see, oops, I selected my Marshall wall as well. Right? So now I'll just set this to a lower level, and I'll make it some height. Right now it's 30 feet tall. So you can see that that wall basically does what I need it to. Maybe I made it too tall. Maybe I want it to be more like 20 feet. But what it's really doing is it's going beneath the model like this. Those are just building walls to start to frame out my site so that when I see it in 3D, I can actually think about relationships of stuff to the building.
If you drag it while it's still in 550, you drag it down to 540, it technically won't be at 540, it's still at level 550.
You're saying, so I think if the question is, let me undo that so that my wall is attached to level 550. Like I can drag the bottom part of the wall down. Is that, but it hasn't actually changed the level it's at. It's just changed the base offset to negative 16 feet or whatever. I dragged it below that level. That's another way of working too. I could take this wall, right, and I could set its base offset to like negative 10 feet, which is basically the same thing as putting it at the 540 level. So there's many different ways to get this to be where I want it to be. For something like this, it doesn't matter. For levels that you're going to use consistently for many things, you want to really associate the object with the level. Okay, so that's how you make a wall of a building. Um, let's say we want to make another type of wall, and this is where I'm going to switch back to wireframe, like a retaining wall. Let's say this one here. So I would do the same thing. Maybe what I would do first is I would go to annotate and get a spot elevation so that I have some idea of the lowest point of the wall, right? So this is a 546 up to 548, right? So I know that I want my wall to be, it doesn't matter how low it goes beneath the topo surface, by the way. So I'm going to put this at 546 or maybe even 545. And then it doesn't matter as much where it is at the top. I just don't want it to be floating and the topo surface goes below it. So, and I can always edit my wall. Right? So here's where I can also think about wall types. Right? But I'm going to do pick lines again. And probably the most annoying thing about pick lines is what is a nice arc in AutoCAD is not in Revit. There's some way to pick, yeah, if I hold tab, it'll pick like a chain of edges, right? And it says I can't keep them joined, unjoin elements, and delete the parts I don't want, right? So that's one way of doing it. The other way could be to make a wall. So I hit tab while I was floating over one line, and it'll select everything that touches. The other one might be to make a tangent and arc, which has similar drawing methods as AutoCAD. Right. But here I will just select the wall, and actually it's going to end up down here. So one other thing you could do, yeah, so this wall has like a million little pieces, right? So that's fine, but it's a little bit more elegant when I make a wall to actually use some of the drawing elements here. Right? It could be an arc. Right? You can draw it a bunch of different ways. You can play around with it. You can rotate it. Oh, for, I don't know why it doesn't want to start here. You have to play around with it. So that's probably a better way, and you can enter the tangent. So now we've got a wall down here, and I'm going to set it at 540. And now you can see it right there. And then I can set the top wall where it says unconnected. You can also set the top at another level if that's the way you want to work. Right. So your wall will look something like this. And then something that you can do, Lauren, you were asking what was next. If you've got your geometry in here, and I'm working with just generic elements, right, we do TW to get back here. One thing you can do is you can start working with your families. Right? So families are these options within a type of or category of thing. Right? So these are different families of walls, and they're all meant for buildings. But you can kind of work with them a little bit. So maybe I'll take like this exterior wall type. Right? And if I change my detail to fine, I can really see a lot of what's going on with this. It's like a capped wall. Maybe that was the wrong one to pick. But let's say I'll pick a retaining wall of concrete. So I can actually edit this, right? I can edit this type. Remember, we have categories, types. I forget what the next one is. Oh, categories, families, types, and instances. So this is a type within the family. So I can go in and I can duplicate this. And again, I got to it by selecting this and hitting this tiny button here, edit type. So right away, I duplicate it and I call it this is all the information about that wall. And there's some really cool analytical stuff around thermal resistance, heat transfer. Maybe someday we will get this. But I really want to go in and click edit on structure, right? So I can add in layers, yes. Because usually I don't want to actually get rid of the other one. Like I like having it there. I just want to duplicate it and then modify the duplicate so I make a new wall type. Yeah. You can edit it if you don't actually like it. You can edit it and change it. But now I can set the thickness of that wall, right? This is a 1 foot thick wall. So I could make it a 1.5 foot thick wall. And let me say okay to that. And okay, you can see that it right away changes. I can go back into edit type and edit the structure. And I can insert like a layer, right? So I can insert, I can call it structure, I can call it facing, for example. And I can set the thickness of that. Let's say it's like a 2-inch facing material, right? And then I can actually click on by category, and there's these tiny 3 dots. And this pulls me into my material browser, right? And there's all kinds of materials in here that I might want to work with, and I can also add new ones. I can edit them further. You can give them patterns for your drawings that we'll get into later, like different fill patterns. But let me look up just brick, right? So 2 different types of brick. I'll go with that for now, right? And I think I can also insert another one, and I can move it down to the other side. Right? And let me keep that category. I'll call it finish, I guess. I can always change those. And then I'll go in here and I'll also make it brick. Oops, and I have to have, there is such a thing as an air membrane in walls, so they do have 0 as a thickness. Right, so now I do have my wall with its facing. Right, so now if I go in and I make a section through this, right, and finish that. Where if I go into my section and I look at that section I just drew, I can actually see, I could hide my CAD file, but you can actually see that there's an outer layer of 2 inches and an inner layer. And you can even see where that wall curves around in elevation. Right? So you can see that the changes I made to that wall are great. They show up. And if I go in and I change the thickness of this to 1 foot, it changes it in section. Yes.
So it's just like when you're altering the thickness, it obviously adjusts it from the center line.
Mm-hmm.
So it's even on both sides when it widens. But is it possible to get it to only again on one side? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Let's see. That's a good question. I'm gonna have to look into that one because I know we can change where the wall is taken off from when we draw line work, but I don't know about the materials. You might think of it as actually assembling two sets of the same material, but I'll look that one up because I'm not 100% sure on that. So if you've gotten your walls in and you want to develop them further, you can start to do families and modify them that way. Now, what about the horizontal surfaces? We'll really quickly show you that. And I think we'll follow up on Monday. But we can do the same process for floors. And in fact, floors also have the same deal. You get a few starter floors, but you can also go in and edit type, right? So this can be for if you did sort of like a gravel path, right? And there was like a layer of sand, a layer of fabric, a layer of gravel. Like you could put that in there. Sometimes it's faster to just draw those details in CAD. But if you're really trying to do materials estimating, that can be really helpful. But so now unlike walls, let me say one thing about walls. Walls do not have a sketch mode that locks you in. I can do stuff with walls and I can leave walls anytime. Most other things like floors, you're in sketch mode, like you can't actually get out unless you accept or escape from those changes. Everything else looks the same, but you want to look for these here. Okay, so this is one landing here, and it's going to be a ramp. And I'm going to do pick lines for this. And you might notice that with a floor, you can actually set up a slope arrow, right? So I'm going to set a slope arrow like this. And you can go in and you can edit that slope arrow. Right? For now, I'm going to just have them be relatively flat, starting at like maybe the high point. Right? But I can go in and I can choose this and click when I've selected my floor. I can go to edit boundary and I can change stuff on here. I can change the width by typing in new dimensions. Right? If I want to make that modification, I don't need to go back to AutoCAD. Right? I could set this to something else and it's going to automatically change it. I can pick these corner points, right? And I can drag them. They don't touch by default. I can add a new corner point in, right? So I can continue to modify this, right? And this slope is set to, no, that's just the dimension length. I'm going to take the slope arrow out for now. Okay. So now I have a different shaped floor. And of course, that floor lives way down here. Right? So much like everything else, I need to set it to a level. Right? So I'm going to set it to whatever level is closest and then edit it from there. Right? Either offsetting it above or in a negative amount to the next lowest level. Right? So that's how I edit my floors. And I can do floors with irregular shapes as well. Right? And so I do all my sketching in plan. I go to architecture, floor, and then pick lines. And this would be for more for like a plaza. Here, just to save myself some time, I could just set it to a level as well. Okay. So I'm going to start by just trying to sketch those out at the relative level that they should be at. Um, there's also, you'll see in architecture here, we have ramps. This is kind of like a wedge, right? It won't let me work in anything besides an elevation. Um, for most people, that wedge is not going to work super well, but you could try it. But for landscape architects, because even a ramp in a building doesn't sheet off water, so it still is only sloped in one direction. So I find it doesn't work quite as well for cross sloping. Once you've got these sketched out at the about the elevation you want this, so say I want to offset this by -2 feet, right? So I've got some stairs that I need in between here. So this is where sometimes I wish you could right click and hide stuff, but I could see myself going into visibility and graphics and hiding my CAD and my topo surface for the moment.
Wait, there's an option that said hide in view.
Oh, you're right. Hide in view, and I just do elements. Forgot about that one. So that's handy. Let me tell you how to undo that. There's no unhide in view. So that's where there's a little one here. There's also temporary hide and isolate. Um, let's see which one it is. Yes, thank you. So if I click on the light bulb, this shows me everything, whether or not it's hidden. And that's where I can right click on something and go to unhide in view elements. Right? Same with my topo surface. I can't unhide something unless I hit that light bulb. And then I click that light bulb again and my view returns to normal. Right? So if I've hidden something, I have to go through this and then find it and then go unhide in view and click elements. And then it's back. But you probably saw that it's a little bit easier to work when I hide some of this noise. It could be distracting. So now I need to put some steps in here. That could be done a bunch of different ways, but steps are one of those things in Revit that actually works well for us. Right? So I can actually put in a set of stairs here. Right? And you can see a couple different types of stairs. Again, they're different types of winders. Right? Right? And these are meant to be like building steps. Right? You can set up landings. And you can set up how they begin and end in terms of their risers. And I would leave everything else as is, right? Like, unless if you have some unique sets of steps, right? Like, let's say they're like very long and actually meant to be like sat on or something like that. I maybe would just model those with floors. I don't know. It doesn't like what I did with them. Right? So I'd have to take some risers out. It did them anyway, though. And there's my stairs there. Right? So obviously, these are like architectural stairs, right? And I could think I can just delete the railings. Right? I think I can even delete. This is where I might go in and change this. Right? You can go in, and I actually think I'm kind of stuck with this family. So there's a couple workarounds. You could keep this. It's actually going to work fine, except for these ugly things on the side, right? So you could keep them for now. You can probably download other families and you can insert them in here, or you could just make floors or walls, which is probably what I would recommend. Later on in the semester, we'll work with a plugin called Foreground that has landscape stairs. So I would use this for now just to just start sketching. And I'm going to set my top level at none. Oh, we can change the angle here. So actually, I do need to set it to 2 different levels. So let's try that. There we go. So you have a little bit of control over the steepness of the stairs. Right? And here I just kind of put it where I think I need it, and then I'm going to set the offset and see what happens. Try to get it to match. So you can start working it out that way, or you can actually just draw them as floors or walls. Okay. Down the road, let me hide this. Down the road, when it comes time to really deal with um, how we slope these, I showed you this a little bit before, but this is where our annotations can help. So clicking annotate and putting spot elevations around. Spot elevations like to be assigned to corners or lines, right? And a spot slope, right? There is no slope. And I can also go into dimensions and something like spot slope types. And set the units to degrees, maybe with 2 decimal places, right? So that when I do slope this, it won't show up in inches, which just shows the difference in elevation. And then I could go to modify sub elements, and I could choose like these two. And let me make them -2 inches. Right? So now we've got basically something that had to triangulate itself, right? Right. If I want to look at the slope here, right, now I can see it's 1.13 degrees. I don't know where it went. So the last thing I want to say is these triangulated elements are fine for now, but if we wanted to get rid of them in our view, we just go into our visibility and graphics, and we would go to floors and expand it and uncheck interior edges, and it'll hide those. That triangulation, I usually leave them in 3D because I want to know where my vertices are that I can work with, but I hide them in plan so that it looks more the way we draw it. Right? So that's a little bit about getting started in Revit, as well as a little bit for those of you who are already in Revit about taking it forward. As I said, later in the semester, we'll work with a few plugins that'll do things like stairs more easily. If you have, as many of you do, a curved ramp, that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. See what happens. Sometimes these end up looking like a bunch of wedges, right? And that's fine. That's usually the way it looks in Revit, right? You have like these sections of something. It takes a while to model, but if you put it in the context of like a months or years long project, like this is a reasonable amount of time. So but you'll start to have an appreciation throughout the semester of the things that are faster in CAD and the things that are faster in Revit. But remember that the key thing that people say about Revit is it's an upfront time investment that saves time down the road. Okay, so any questions? Yes.
So just to clarify, to work on CAD corrected contours is
So the question was in CAD, like assigning elevation to the contours or correcting them?
yeah, so like do you recommend changing your grading?
Yeah, you want your CAD to match your hand drawn grading or whatever's newest, right? Because the CAD contours are what's going to generate the topo surface. And I at least want you to go through that process. But at the very least, even if you don't end up staying with Revit for the whole semester, you're going to need the CAD line work to be updated anyway. Yes? Yeah, did we want you to bring in the existing and the new contours? Um, let's say, well, if you're in a scenario where you've completely redone every contour, right? There's nothing left that's existing except for where it meets the building, then just bring in the new. For many of you, you're using an existing contour and then breaking off from that with new grading, in which case what I would do with that is I would put them on two different layers, but have them have the same assigned elevation, because later on you're going to want to be able to visualize existing contours and new contours differently. But give them both the same elevation so that you can select the multiple layers for the topo surface. And for the grad students who are simply redrawing an existing plan, it's a little easier for you. You just sort of trace over what has been built and work with those to generate the topo surface, and just make sure in AutoCAD in the properties you assign them the right elevation. But for the undergrads who are kind of mixing existing and new contours, you just want to be able to differentiate between them down the road, not forget what was existing and what wasn't. So, because in a grading plan, we show existing contours as dashed, and we only show the part of the existing contour we keep, and then we show new contours as solid line. So you want to be able to just know which is which. Let's go to our site plan. The issue being that you couldn't see the CAD file when it was first brought in. So by default, the view range of a site plan is from 0 up to 200 feet above sea level. So you have to go to Edit and set the top to unlimited and set the cut plane to something higher than your file.
Okay.
Right. So usually it looks something like this. Right. And I think maybe there's something else here where I set it here. I don't know why this is showing. It doesn't at first, I can tell you that. So typically what you want to do is just change these to higher levels than what you have. Something like 600 feet should do, and then it should show you. Try that right now, and I'll take a look.
Okay.